Today, we are talking about Antifa, the alleged, supposedly anti-fascist group that isn't anti-fascist. They are, in fact, fascist. And it has been labeled by the President of the United States a legit terrorist, domestic terrorist organization. Traveling around as I do, I decided to look them up and to see if I could find a meeting in the city where I was. And sure enough, I did. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to attend. I don't go with the press credentials. I just go and just hang out and sit and listen to the conversations that are taking place, because you get something very different from that. It would be foolish to underestimate them, and that is because Charlie Kirk's assassin started his radicalizing, started in a place much like this. You know, I've spent my career taking on some of the cultural baddies, some of the most prominent intellectuals in the world, some of them in public debate, some of them behind the scenes. And I've come to realize that ideas define everything that we do. With an academic degree, you're trained to be a researcher and writer to the point that it's annoying. But I'm grateful for it. I'm not talking about books I've not read. I'm not talking about papers I've not read. Whether I agree with them or not actually isn't the point. There are quite a few books that I would read that I would say are actually evil books. Donald Trump, when he was in a divorce with his first wife, she said he has a copy of Mein Kampf next to his bed. I wish more people did. If the German people had bothered to read that book rather than just have it on their shelf, we might have avoided the Holocaust. If more people read the Quran, they'd be wiser to what Islam actually is, what they actually believe. If people bothered to read, as I have, the writings of Klaus Schwab and the various contributors to the World Economic Forum and the ideas that are driving the globalists, I read them because I want to understand their mentality. I cut out the middleman. I go straight to the ideology. Everything in your life is being defined by either your ideas or the ideas of the people around you. And each episode, we're going to be digging into a different idea that appears in the culture. This is Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton. Today, we are talking about Antifa, the alleged, supposedly anti-fascist group that isn't anti-fascist. They are, in fact, fascist. The thing is, they just don't really seem to recognize or know that. The higher-ups do, but the rank and file members of this terrorist organization, and it has been labeled by the President of the United States a legit terrorist, domestic terrorist organization, which may be funded from abroad, which is worth bearing in mind. And I want to talk about them because I had mentioned in a previous episode of Ideas Have Consequences, a recent one, that I was going to attend one of their meetings. And it may be that I start attending a lot of these kinds of meetings around the country. But traveling around as I do, I decided to look them up and to see if I could find a meeting in the city where I was that I might be able to attend it. And sure enough, I did. I found a meeting that was kind of, somewhat covertly, advertised online. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to attend. I'm going to practice. I'm going to employ my WEF strategy, the World Economic Forum, which I attend, each year, and I will again in 2026, God willing, where I just go and I'm a fly on the wall. Again, I don't go, members of the posse, people who follow Ideas Have Consequences, follow my work. They know that I don't go with the press credentials. I don't go with camera equipment. I don't go with microphones. I just go and just hang out and sit and listen to the conversations that are taking place, because you get something very different from that. It's not necessarily that you get something better. It's just that you get something different. And more than 70% of the WEF presentations are online anyway, and there are plenty of people there with press credentials and microphones and cameras, doing interviews. When I say you get something different, when you just attend meetings of this type and you just are listening. You're not there to debate. You're not there to argue. You're not there to confront. You're not there to interview. You're just listening. People speak more freely, and you get more of an idea of who they actually are, what they're actually about. And such was the case here. And presumably this was a meeting that was open to everyone. And it was held very near, which I think is important here in our discussion today. This particular meeting was held near an urban campus in the heart of a big city. And it was held at a kind of shabby, but food was decent, restaurant. And that's so that students, could attend. And something, if you're not really engaged with university life these days, then you might not really be aware of what that life kind of looks like. And you have in America, you have your traditional universities. And by that, I mean places like, for instance, small town America, Lincoln, Nebraska, Athens, Georgia, Knoxville, Tennessee, loads of other campuses, like that, where the university, on a traditional campus like that, you have the quad, which is the heart of the university. And then you have major sports teams, which students participate in. And the university itself kind of dominates the life of that small town. Urban campuses are different. They're very different. They're usually like, say, a Northwestern, University of Chicago, places like that, where the university doesn't dominate the city. It's just one of many things that are going on in the city, and where the undergraduate program is very non-traditional. So you don't, typically have the same kind of, say, Greek life, sorority row and fraternity row, and you don't have that quad experience, and you don't have the feeling that the university is the heart and soul of the city. And urban campuses attract, usually it's their graduate programs with non-traditional students, people seeking an MBA or, going to med school or law school or pharmacy school or whatever the case may be. It's usually those kind of programs that dominate in urban campuses, and the undergraduate programs attract a very different sort of individual. Not always, but you typically find in these urban campuses among undergraduates, you typically find a more disaffected group of people, individuals who might be, say, marginalized on a traditional campus. So you find, let's say, goth or homosexual or trans or atheist or whatever. They're much more prevalent in the universities that are in urban environments. And such was the case here. And I got there early to assess, the situation. I had seen what time their program was supposed to start at 7 p.m., their meeting. So I got there, maybe about 6:30. And so did the leader of this particular group, who I had seen, online. This was an individual who was a man-bunned 40-ish university professor. And that I also think is significant. So these kinds of groups are targeting students, and they're often being led, such as, back in the 1960s, such as the, Mao's Cultural Revolution, often being led by, professors, individuals in institutions who are seeking to radicalize, students. And so this guy got there a little bit early too. He completely ignored me. He went and gathered a few chairs, in a circle, and sat in a corner of the restaurant. And I sat at a nearby table, planning to identify myself once the meeting started, that I was there just to gain information like anybody else. After a while, of him sitting there, and this to me, all of this was quite fascinating, a scruffy, kind of overweight student, a grad student, I think, but I'm not sure of that, joined him. And again, ignoring me, this particular professor, he held forth loudly on a wide range of issues as the two of them waited for other people to arrive. And here's just a sampling of some of the things that were being said. And again, this was all very loud. So I'm not sitting, I don't have microphones, over there where I'm trying to, listen in on their conversation in some sort of covert way. I'm sitting in the area where this meeting is supposed to take place, and they're just sitting a few feet from me. And this particular professor is holding forth with his graduate student. And part of that dynamic here is that you have a professor who has his fans among students, and that alone isn't necessarily a bad thing. When I was teaching, I was very aware of the fact that I had a number of students who were who were very loyal to my teaching and to my classes, and sometimes saw it as a competition between myself and someone else who might be teaching the same or a similar subject. If you're a good teacher, you're a good professor, you're not trying to create that, but it is useful in that it's an opportunity for you to have a positive influence on students because it gives you the opportunity perhaps to mentor them. But the same kind of influence can be used in a very pernicious way. You can use that influence, as I say in this case, to radicalize students, to get them to do things that are not good for them or are not good for other people. You can use that influence to convince students of all kinds of wicked things. And I think that's part of what was going on here. And the dynamic with this particular student and this professor was you have a professor and you have his adoring fan. And he's sitting and holding forth on all of these topics, which I thought were very interesting. And one of them was, he began by talking about how he had underestimated the backlash to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. That he had no idea that this long, more than a month now after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, that there would still be this strong sentiment, a kind of resistance to the left that has grown out of that. And he was saying, I grossly underestimated what would happen in the aftermath of that. Now, I want to be clear, I did not sense that either of them were celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I never got the impression that they were, had advocated for it. But they clearly did not like Charlie Kirk. And they went on to say that he was ignorant and he was uneducated. Uneducated in what they mean by that is that, of course, he didn't have a college degree. And I should say this about Charlie. In Charlie's case, that may have been something that prevented him from being radicalized. Students are being handed over to universities these days, and their parents do not seem to realize that they are funding the radicalization of their own children. And you see, because Charlie didn't go to university, he wanted to go to West Point, and he was rejected, and it seemed that God had another plan for him. And so Charlie took loads of online courses from Hillsdale College and a variety of other places where he, wasn't radicalized. He wasn't put in those kind of social settings. At certain times, wise investors look for stability. Markets are overinflated. Inflation remains a concern, and global tensions continue to rise. That's why many are turning to the safety of physical gold and silver. Alpha Omega Gold is a Christian-owned precious metals company known for honesty, transparency, and biblical stewardship principles. Their team help clients protect their investment with integrity and clear guidance, never pressure. Right now, Alpha Omega Gold is offering a free precious metals navigation guide to explain why owning gold and silver can be a smart, strategic hedge for retirement accounts and long-term security. Don't wait until economic shifts impact your future. So today, go and visit www.ao.gold/IHC. or call 855-4AO-GOLD. That's 855-426-4653. Call today to learn how simple it can be to secure what matters most. And by the way, our universities these days, with very rare exception, are incubators of radicalism. I believe it's George Barna, who maybe this data is old, and this isn't it exactly. I'm going off the top of my head here. But George Barna, I believe about 20 years ago, they did a study of students of Christians entering universities in what their belief system was as they were going in and what their belief system was upon graduation. And the data looks something like this. Again, this isn't exact, but the data looks something like this. And by the way, I would love for somebody, maybe Jonathan can find it, or somebody find me this data, because this data is fascinating. But it went something like this: of 10 students entering, say, Auburn University who are Christians, who self-identified as Christians, 7 graduated still saying that they were Christians. Of 10 students self-identifying as Christians who went to University of Chicago, 4 graduated still saying that they were Christians. Of 10 students self-identifying as Christians going to UC Berkeley, 3 graduated still saying they were Christians. And it did this with a variety of universities around the country, and it gave you a picture of what all of us, or at least most of us, already knew, and that was that universities were demolishing, and in many cases, quite deliberately, that this is my staff were hard at work trying to locate the information that I've requested, but that universities, in many cases, quite deliberately, were seeking to demolish the tender faith of the students who were entering, those institutions. So, that just, and today, and again, that information, that particular study is probably about 20 years old, and I can only imagine it's a great deal worse. So we've located that, and we'll put it in the show notes. We'll put it in the show notes afterwards so that you can see this. Has it been updated?
70% leave college and announce their faith.
70. Let me repeat that. 70%. And is this modern data?
It's modern data. This is from Google AI. It says that some sources citing research suggest that over 70% of college students who profess Christianity leave with little to no faith by the time of graduation.
Okay, let me repeat that if you didn't hear that. What Jonathan, my producer over here, just said, and he can wave a magic tech wand and find things like this, that according to modern data, according to Google AI, of students who professed Christianity entering into university, and this is all universities here, not just a specific one, 70%, on average, 70% graduate having denied their faith. So you see, this is what's happening. And I would suggest to you that it's far worse in some parts of the country and in urban campuses. Now, I'm just speaking for anecdotal experience here, but I've spoken on loads of campuses, and the urban campuses are almost always worse. There is something a bit dehumanizing about, in my opinion, I'll sound very Jeffersonian here, but about what happens to people, what happens to human beings in hyper-urban settings. And that is something that's somewhat dehumanizing, that takes place there. And by the way, this is also borne out by the data. America until 1920 was primarily, the population of America until 1920 primarily was rural. And then from then, the scales began to tip until now, less than 14% of Americans live in rural areas. And what has happened over the course of the last century, well, I would suggest quite a lot that isn't particularly good in this country from a social, from a cultural perspective. But in any case, you have you have professors who are leading these things, and according to this guy, Charlie was ignorant, he was uneducated, and his fans were, quote, fascists. They were fascists. So I'm sitting there and I'm following, as I say, my WEF strategy, which meant I stayed anonymous, but I was biting my tongue and I wanted to say, define for me what fascism is and how Charlie Kirk and his fans were fascists. Explain to me what that means. I would bet that they could not logically answer that question because it makes no sense. We have described on Ideas Have Consequences in fairly recent episodes. We put a lot of emphasis on what fascism is, what Marxism is, communism, socialism, what these words mean, Nazism, what they all mean. And the left misuses them in some cases quite deliberately. But again, here, Charlie Kirk, he was ignorant, uneducated, and his fans were fascist, according to this particular professor. But again, I want to emphasize here, I did not sense that they advocated violence against Charlie Kirk or celebrated it. They didn't miss him, but I did not sense that they were celebrating it. And then they went on to say basically the same thing, that red state Americans, anybody who is MAGA, which they made reference to, was also ignorant, uneducated, and fascist. They talked a bit about ICE and Trump tyranny, which again is sort of a figment of their imagination. These are people who really believe this stuff. I mean, they really do. And this is why we're going to be reading this book here. I haven't assigned it yet, but again, I mentioned it on a recent episode of Ideas Have Consequences. Demons, it's also sometimes translated as the possessed or devils, but it's by Fyodor Dostoevsky. We'll put a link to Amazon in show notes. You can get the Constance Garnett translation, which is called The Possessed, is very good. It was done in 1916. It has kind of a Victorian sort of flair, to the language. It's very readable. Or you can get, this particular translation right here as well. But the book is about how ideologies are like demons themselves, and they sock puppet their hosts. And it's the kind of thing we've seen in America increasingly over the course of the last decade, since I would say, Trump's first term. And it's people like this professor who are producing such individuals, who are radicalizing them because they themselves have been radicalized. And such was the case here. So again, in their mind, Trump is a fascist. Trump is a tyrant. How you can historically, logically make that argument is absolutely beyond me. It is beyond me. And at this point, I want to interject another little story to illustrate this point. I maybe didn't tell you this, but I was going to have, I was in Berlin recently, and I met a guy who was a defector. This is before the wall, came down in November of 1989. This guy defected from East Berlin, from the old GDR, the so-called German Democrat Republic. He defected to the West. And I met him, and he was telling me this story, and he was touring me around the city. Interesting guy. And here's what fascinates me. He unwittingly would agree with just about all of the opinions he shared with me that day, would go straight down the line with MAGA. He was talking about how Berlin has been transformed negatively by the influx, by the mass importation of Muslims into that country. And that it was just, leading to the third worlding of parts of Berlin and certainly parts of Germany. And he talked about, how the evils of communism, of Marxism, of socialism, of all these kinds of things. And then he talked about his defection and all of this. And I said to him, I'd love to bring you to the United States. I'd love to have you on my show to tell your story, because young people today don't know anything about this kind of stuff. And they need to know. They don't know their history, and they need to know. They need to understand the evils of this. And your testimony could be very, very powerful. Well, again, I had a delightful time with him, and by his own account, he thoroughly enjoyed the day we spent together. So he's planning to come. I hear nothing from him for about a month, and then I get a text from him that says, "Did you vote for Trump?" And I said, "Yes, I did. Is that a problem?" And he replied and said, "It might be." And I never heard from him again. Now, I tell that story because as it relates to this, it's the same kind of mentality. These are individuals who have been subjected to a Joseph Goebbels-like propaganda machine, and they believe these things. So he went from having a good time with me, having thoughtful conversation with me over lunch, over coffee, touring all over the city, me telling him a little bit about my work, him telling me about his own work and about his life, us agreeing on, I can't think of anything major we disagreed on. But then I'm pretty sure that in his mind, he decided I was a fascist. He never said it, but I think that's what he's bought into and that he believes. And it is because people say, mainstream media, legacy media is dead. And I say, you're wrong to say that. It is not dead. And it's because it is effective with a certain demographic who believe it. They believe it. They don't question the things they ought to question. They don't research properly the things they should research. And they're not connecting dots. You would think, here's a guy who grew up under the tyranny of the GDR, and he cannot see that post-collapse of the Berlin Wall and of the old Soviet Union, of which he suffered under, that same ideology is now being championed by the left. And now he's championing the same thing unwittingly. And see, that's what we're trying to do on this show, is we're trying to help you connect those dots so that you don't fall prey to people like this. So that you do not fall prey to people like this. So again, in his mind, they saw themselves, these guys, as they're sitting there in this restaurant, they were elitists to the core. They saw themselves as sophisticated intellectuals who really understood everything that was going on all around them, and that the ordinary people, the common people of America, they're just backward and stupid. That's the way they see them. And they see themselves as, I couldn't help as I was sitting there thinking of Plato's allegory of the cave, because, if you know the allegory of the cave, it's this story of, and I won't go into the whole thing, but people are sitting and they can't see the entrance to the cave. What they're seeing are shadows on the wall, which they mistake for reality. And then in Plato's, as the allegory goes on, there are a few people who kind of figure it out, and they make their way out into the light where they see reality. And these, for Plato, were the philosopher kings. Those were the people who by virtue of their sophistication, had a right to rule over everybody else. These people see themselves like that. They're that bloody arrogant. That's the way they see themselves. Anyway, they were talking about someone who had a mutual friend who'd been deported to Central America or South America, and that they wanted to help her family. And this, by the way, I have no problem with that. That strikes me as, as noble, as admirable, as good. But they were also trying to, to raise money, presumably to bring her back into the country somehow. So that, of course, a violation of law. But their desire to help someone, I have no problem with that at all. And the conversation was the typical fare of the left. I mean, you'd heard the same things during that period of time when I was sitting in that restaurant, if you'd have just been sitting, watching MSNBC or CNN, BBC, you'd be getting the same kind of stuff. Well, 7 o'clock, which was when their meeting was scheduled to start, came and went, and no one else came. No one else showed up. So the confab continued, and they lamented the lack of interest in social justice. The professor himself said he was trying to get other students involved, but they were reluctant. And it sounded a bit coercive, like he was trying to pressure students to join this group. But he used the word reluctant, that so-and-so, this young woman and this young woman and this young man, they were all reluctant to get involved. They were reluctant to get involved, and thus they were both sitting there feeling pretty smug that they themselves want to make a difference for social justice, but it was hard to get other people involved. The professor, spoke of his disdain, which was echoed by this student of his, for another professor who was Jewish. I know this because I looked him up on the faculty website afterwards. And he was a target of theirs for some reason, so much so that this professor said that he was supplying information to a reporter for what sounded like a hit piece. Why were they targeting this particular professor? I'm speculating at this point. I don't know, but the impression I got was that it was related to Gaza and Palestine. Makes sense given the fact that he's Jewish. It was related to Gaza and Palestine, and somehow this professor was viewed as a kind of oppressor himself, and they were out to get him. I've been waiting for, and I've been doing searches for the article, waiting for it to come out, which will give me more information when it does that may fill in some of the gaps here. I couldn't always hear everything that was being said. But again, this seemed to be related to Palestine. Well, 7:15 became 7:30, and still no one else came. And I could feel their enthusiasm begin to wane. And rather than waiting until they left, I've been sitting there now for about an hour, 45 minutes or so, listening to these two pontificate. I collected my tray and threw my trash away, and I left the university, or I left the restaurant, and I decided I would go and just sit and think on this and make a few notes about what I had heard from this group that at least would fashion themselves as Antifa, social justice warriors. And here's what I conclude from this meeting. Several things. First of all, these guys are what Solzhenitsyn would call little lambs. Little lambs. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian dissident writer who died in, I think, 2008. What Solzhenitsyn meant by that is that they're not the ones to be feared most. I didn't get the impression that these were individuals who are going to be turning over and burning cop cars anytime soon, or were going to be, positioning themselves on rooftops to take shots at the president of the United States or other so-called, MAGA sorts. But it would be foolish to underestimate them. It would be foolish to underestimate them, and that is because although their meeting wasn't successful, they didn't have any, real attendees, just the two of them, doesn't mean it can't grow into that. And Charlie Kirk's assassin started somewhere, started in a place much like this. And they were particularly concerned with things related to the left's, as you would expect, sordid sexual agenda. They saw such people as oppressed. They saw them as oppressed. Both the professor and his student were white. And typically, I wouldn't make mention of such things because it often just doesn't interest me. But I find this increasingly to be typical among crowds like this. The restaurant staff was mostly black, and they were, pleasant and helpful. But here you have, a couple of individuals who don't strike me as oppressed peoples. They don't strike me as individuals who are really suffering under any kind of Trump tyranny as they sit there and laugh and shovel down food and talk about how awful, the tyranny they're living under really is. They're free to choose, their occupations, provided people are willing to hire them. The student is free to choose that university or another a university, provided that he's accepted, and to choose his future career. So there's no real oppression going on there. But again, when you see these Antifa groups, you often find that they're mostly, white radicalizers who see themselves, and in this they're quite racist. They see themselves as champions on behalf of people of color, who, to my knowledge, have not requested their help. But that's the way they see themselves. But again, I wouldn't underestimate them. Just because they didn't strike me as the sort who are going to be killing people or throwing rocks through windshields or setting things on fire. I'm reluctant to dismiss them entirely because they can be radicalized. And that process starts somewhere. And by the way, they're already on the way to that because they already believe that they're living in, the modern equivalent of Nazi Germany. That's what they seem to think. Both of them fed upon each other's arrogance. However, I did detect a genuine, if misguided, moral conscience. Their desire to help the family of the woman who'd been deported. That's admirable. And though they were possessed by an outsized sense of self-importance, I mean, they saw themselves as foot soldiers for the revolution, they really did want to make a difference for their cause. Any Christian can understand that because we believe that we're put here to make a difference. We believe we're called to fulfill the Great Commission. Go therefore into all the world, making disciples. We believe that. So we understand the desire for mission. And human beings are created by God. We're teleological beings, meaning we're purposeful beings. We need purpose. And they wanted purpose. They wanted a big mission, a big opportunity to make a big difference in the world. Where I, as a Christian, and where you, as a Christian, would or should disagree with them is in the details of what they mean by making a difference. There's a very big difference in what they would mean and what we would mean. The professor saw himself as a champion on behalf of society's victims, who generally consist of people whose victimhood is an illusory racism, or those who have chosen a perverse sexual lifestyle and interpret their marginalization by the mainstream as oppression. They think they're oppressed because someone says, "Don't want that in my school. Don't want that around my children. Don't want that on my TV." Not voting for that. They see that as oppression, and they use terms like genocide. There's a trans genocide and this kind of thing. But the meeting was, at the end of the day, exactly what I expected it would be, and that's a big bunch of nothing. Is a big bunch of nothing. It was individuals with massive goals, massive agenda, but unorganized, not clear on what the objectives really were beyond just overthrowing the tyranny. Not even particularly clear on the details of why they want to overthrow the tyranny, beyond the fact that they just say they're fascist. But again, I'm pretty confident if I'd asked them to define that in how the average American who would vote for Donald Trump is a fascist, I'm pretty sure they could not have given me a logical answer to that question. I've yet to meet anyone who can. I related how when I was in Berlin, a driver that I had there kept saying that Trump was a fascist. And I finally, I bit my tongue long enough. I finally said, explain that, defend that. How? How is that so? How is it that people who want their borders defended, who want a rational, a reasonable immigration policy, who are not in favor of mutilating children or killing the unborn, who don't like being labeled, racists or bigots or fascists simply because they love their country, how is it that people like that, in your view, are fascist? Explain that. And I've yet to meet anyone who can. I've yet to meet anyone who can, because all the radicalizing is being done on the other side. All of the rioting is coming on the other side. All the violence and statue toppling is happening on the other side. But they buy the propaganda and they believe it. And this, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, I relate to you this story because, first of all, I plan to attend a lot more of these kind of meetings around the country. I decided I want to do something very similar to what we did maybe, I guess about 15 years ago. I think it was in I don't remember if it was 2013, 2011, somewhere in there. I published a piece in The Atlantic called Listening to Young Atheists, and that piece went viral big time. Listening to Young Atheists, Lessons for a Stronger Christianity, that's the title that The Atlantic itself gave it. I didn't give it that title, and I'm sure they would never publish a piece like that today. But what I had done is I decided I wanted to interview high school and college age atheists. And so we put out ads, as it were, with various, they call themselves free thought societies. These are atheist organizations set up on campuses. We put out, advertising with those groups, and they began spreading the word that Larry Alex Taunton, who's debated, a lot of high level atheists, he wants to interact with us. He wants to interview us. And so we did. We interviewed students all over the country. We did this over the course of 2 years, I think. And the culmination of that research became that particular piece in The Atlantic, Listening to Young Atheists. We'll also put that in the show notes so you can go and read that. But it was very, very insightful, and it was insightful for youth directors and pastors and various others around the country, because it gave you a glimpse into how these people think. Well, that's what this particular meeting was. It was offering me insight. Now, are they anomalous? I don't know. It may be that I go to another meeting and discover that the other groups that are like this are not like this, in the sense they may be far further along and they're radicalizing. I might find people who really are ready to commit treasonous acts, who are ready to commit great violence, to foment dissent that results in violence and rioting. These guys, Solzhenitsyn's right, little lambs. Little lambs. They do not fall into that category yet, but they could eventually get there. But again, I've decided I want to start attending some of these groups around the country, and maybe it will lead to me engaging with them. I'm not frightened by doing this. This is right in my wheelhouse. Doesn't mean that something terrible can't happen to me. It may have been a type, types like this, that brought on the swatting, to my home. But the point simply being here that I want to try to get an insight into these people, because listen, as Christians, at the very least, we want to know what the opposition thinks. We want to know how they think. We want to know what they believe. And then if we have the opportunity, we want the opportunity to share the gospel with them, to point them towards truth. One of the things that came, home to me with startling clarity is I come back to what I said earlier, that we're teleological beings. We are purposeful beings. We were born for purpose. And people search for meaning. They search for purpose. They long for purpose. Now, if you're a Christian, you know that purpose is found, your true purpose is only found in the person of Jesus Christ. If you're outside of that, you don't believe that, then you will search for meaning in something else. It might be in your 401k. It might be in your spouse or your fiance or your boy or girlfriend. Or it might be in some kind of ism, feminism, atheism, environmentalism. It might be found in some sort of false religion, which most isms usually are. But the point is, you're looking for it. And people really want a grand meaning, a grand purpose for their life. I think it's Stephen Curtis Chapman who spoke of Christianity as our place within Christianity, the song "The Great Adventure." I mean, there's no greater mission than aiding our Lord in reclaiming this world for Him. That's our mission. And what a grand vision it is, what a grand purpose it is to know that the God of the universe, the one who said, "Let there be light," the one who sent His Son to become flesh and dwell among us and to give His life as a ransom for many and to be resurrected and ascend into heaven. How wonderful is it to know that He knows you, that He's counted the very hairs upon your head, that He knows the limit of your days, and that He says, join me. Not because He needs us. He certainly doesn't need me, doesn't need you, but because He wants us to join Him in that mission. I am driven by mission. I'm very clear on my mission. I'm not easily distracted from my mission. I take great joy in my mission. Individuals like this, my heart aches because I think students like this, less so their professors, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but students like this are longing for this, and they don't even know it. They're longing for true mission. And so they find themselves latching on to ideologies like this, dangerous ideologies like this, because it gives them the intoxicating illusion that they're harnessed to the steam engine of history, to use the words of, or loosely use the words of Christopher Hitchens, and speaking of his own radicalizing days when he was an atheist and a communist. This intoxicating illusion that you are harnessed to the steam engine of history, that you are on the cutting edge, and that you're changing the world. It is why radical movements, be they fascist, be they Marxist, communist, have always used young people as their shock troops, as cannon fodder. It is what the left is doing. And by the way, this catch and release policy of criminals that we're seeing in Democrat-held metropolitan centers all over the country, where somebody commits some kind of heinous act and then a few days later is released again or sentenced to really nothing. There's a strategy in this. The strategy isn't just simply to, because they care about these individuals and want to get them back out on the street, that they might be vibrant, thriving, contributing citizens. The purpose of it is to send a message to would-be terrorists. It is to send a message to would-be killers, to would-be rioters, to would-be subversive types. We've got your back. Go and kill and destroy. Go and cause as much mayhem, as much chaos as you possibly can, attacking these people, the MAGA types. Go and do that, and know we've got your back. If you're arrested, and we'll try to keep that from happening too, but if you're arrested, our DAs will do their best to get you right back out on the street again so that you can go do more of it. So Democrats aren't sorry about what happened to Charlie Kirk. They're not sorry about what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. They're not sorry about Ferguson. They're not sorry about Portland. They're not sorry about any of this stuff, other than that there's not more of it. And they do want more of it. So buckle up, be prepared for that. But I also want to say to you, engage the world around you and let us reclaim our youth. The left have targeted our youth. We need to fortify their hearts and their minds and to prepare them for the world that they are going to eventually find themselves in. And by the way, I'm going to be speaking on this topic this Saturday in Nashville. By the time this episode airs, that will already be in the rearview mirror. But I was so delighted that the topic that this particular group, Doug Wilson and others who are going to be there, that they want me to talk about is how to raise warriors. How to raise warriors in a culture that is corrosive to faith in Jesus Christ. I'm looking forward to doing that, but I'm also looking forward to doing it on this particular show. So I want to encourage you to try to raise your children by engaging them on these kinds of issues, engaging them with truth, and acquainting them with the great adventure, the great mission that they've been called to. Kids long for that. They want it. And when they don't find it, when you don't introduce them to it, they end up finding it somewhere else. And that somewhere else is almost always a very evil place. This has been another episode of Ideas Have Consequences with me, Larry Alex Taunton.